Hi, I'm Todd Raffel, and I am here with Russell Podgorski. And Russell and I are talking about healthcare hiring, healthcare assessment, healthcare evaluation, a lot of things that really apply actually to any industry, however. And Russell spent roughly 20 years at Providence, third largest nonprofit health system, where he had a very successful stint. Um, Improving retention and diversity and quality of hire and the hiring time and about everything else there, and really building up the executive recruiting function there. And he has gotten a new job at AMN Healthcare. He is at AMN now, and we're going to talk about that, talk about Russell, but then we're going to talk about nonprofit hiring. I'm sorry, healthcare hiring, not necessarily nonprofit evaluating and selecting. We're going to talk about moving beyond the resume and what else you can learn about a candidate. And we're going to talk about cultural fit and diversity. Anyhow, Russell, just briefly in a minute, tell us if you don't know what AMN, if people don't know what AMN is, tell us that and also what you're doing and going to be doing at
Yeah,
AMN Healthcare.
absolutely.
If I didn't say so, he is in Texas outside of Austin, by the way.
Mm.
Yeah.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Todd. And just a brief background. So, 20 years I've been immersed in the healthcare industry, specifically in the TA space. I spent 11 years building out and leading the executive search function for what became the third largest nonprofit health system in the country. Now I have the privilege and honor of conducting exec search for AMN Healthcare, focused specifically on the C-suite and academic practices nationwide. So beyond the search process, I also work as an executive resume writer, career coach. So I work with candidates on getting them to articulate their unique value proposition. So I really get to see both sides of the coin. And AMN is an amazing organization, mission centered, values aligned with mine, of serving the poor and the vulnerable, those that really need, good access to patient care. And so I'm committed really to finding top talent, top leadership talent.
Good. First, let's talk about, so you work really both sides with candidates and with hirers, employers.
Mhm.
Um, so with candidates, you're working on articulating themselves beyond what's on their resume, whether that's in an interview or otherwise. And we're going to talk about, let's talk about what that means to an employer. What should they look for? How should they try to read beyond what's kind of in this uh,
Mhm.
quantitative document?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I work with candidates and then, hiring leaders and search committees, right? Those that are tasked with evaluating talent and really elevating the assessment. And while the resume is a good starting point and it's really important because it's a document that is articulating a candidate's value proposition and impact, I'd say this about the assessment process, which is really, really important. So, AI, right? You got human intelligence and you've got AI. So, while I think, can efficiently surface candidates based on like a quantitative achievements and keywords, I think successful executive leadership, Todd, is about future potential, adaptive capacity, nuanced human skills, right? So AI, I think, has its place, but when you really think about executive leadership and looking beyond the resume, that's really going to require deep human judgment. So what do I mean by that exactly, right? Because that's kind of fuzzy.
Right.
But number one, I'd say, when we're looking at executive talent, and digging deeper qualitatively, right? So beyond I think strategic thinking and foresight, really important. That's one bucket. So it's not just about having a strategy, but how they arrived at that strategy. Like, what's their intellectual curiosity about? Their ability to connect disparate dots. Like, what is that about? Because when we're looking at leadership and executives, like strategic agility is just clearly and obviously very important. So, can they anticipate market shifts? Like in healthcare, can I just say, wow, There's never a dull moment. There's change every minute of the day. Look at the politics and the macroeconomic environment that we're actually working in right now. So it really does require strategic agility and acumen of that leader. So it's not just about having a strategy, but again, how do they arrive at it? How do they process, right? Can they anticipate market shifts, industry disruptions? How do they formulate proactive visions, right? What is that about? So, what I think what's really key for hiring teams, like, okay, so that's a lot of information there, Russell. But what does that mean for me as a hiring executive or leader, or somebody that's on an interview panel evaluating executives? You really need to probe beyond simple statements of strategy. So, example, tell me about a time when you anticipated like a major shift of disruption in the industry. That's just behavioral interviewing, right? Situational interviewing.
Yeah.
You got to probe a lot deeper, right? Make it very conversational, right? In an executive level interview. But, example, how did you prepare your team organization? What were the early signals that you observed? What was the ultimate outcome? What performance behaviors did you exemplify to achieve that result? I think you really need to dig very deep on that and look at the executive's resume too. Ask questions during the course of the interview. Oh, I see you achieve this strategically. Tell me a little bit more about that. Continue to probe, right? A lot of where the gold nuggets are during a conversation and an interview is the probing of the questions, not necessarily the first response, right? So,
Nice.
any questions about that, Todd? Any
And
follow-ups
this
for
is
me?
all strategic thinking that you're assessing here, correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
totally.
what else? What else are you looking for beyond the resume?
Yeah, emotional intelligence and
Okay.
self-awareness. It's very important of any executive leader. What do I mean by that? Absolutely non-negotiable for executive leadership. It underpins effective team dynamics, conflict resolution, stakeholder management, organizational culture. I was at, the third largest nonprofit health system in the country, recruiting executive talent in addition to my leadership responsibilities. At the end of the day, in addition to strategic agility, we really looked at EQ. Like, how are their emotions, right? Are they aware of their emotions? And then what they say, how they say it, their behaviors that they're exemplifying in an organization, how's it impacting other people? Can they read the room? Are they in a discussion with their one on one? It's just really important. Why is that? Because at the end of the day, Todd, I think EQ, self awareness, really important because it has an implication in terms of how that person is perceiving you and the impact that you're leaving on that individual. And then how are you kind of then partnering with that individual that you're interacting with or that team to really work through a lot of stuff together as a team. That could be conflict, that could be problems. You're often working with a myriad of different individuals, not just one, in a consensus matrix driven organization to accomplish big strategic goals. So you need to be self aware and you need to have high EQ.
Okay. I got strategic thinking, I got EQ, anything else?
Yeah, I'd say leadership style and influence, hugely important. So uh, when when search committees or interview panels are evaluating executives, those two things, right? Um, Strategy, self awareness, EQ, leadership style, and influence. Okay, what does that mean exactly? Well, I'll tell you what it means. How do they inspire and motivate? Are they directive? Are they collaborative? Are they empowering? Are they adaptable in different situations? How effectively do they influence upwards, downwards, sideways across the organization without direct authority. You know, um, Organizations that many of the executives that I've recruited, where they go, it's all indirect leadership, meaning they have to lead by influence. These individuals that they're leading to accomplish big goals or solve big problems organizationally, these individuals that they're working with don't report into them. So how are you going to empower and motivate and inspire people? How are you going to get people to do what you really need to get done because you can't do it alone? So what's key for hiring teams, right? At the end of the day, the net here is how when you're evaluating executives, leadership. How do you define effective leadership in today's complex environment? Like, what does that look like? So, when you're interviewing an executive, give me an example of how you intentionally adapted your leadership style, as an example, to different team dynamics. Walk me through a specific example of when that actually happened.
Yeah.
Um, how did you adapt your leadership style to different, team dynamics or organizational challenges to achieve a better outcome? I would say too, resilience and adaptability,
Hmm.
hugely important. Continual learning is just you need to really probe to understand exactly what is a leader in our world and environment that's changing exponentially. How is this leader truly adapting? How are they learning? What is their resilience like? Their adaptability? You know this, Todd. You're an executive yourself. Executive roles are inherently dynamic. They're high pressure. They often involve navigating significant ambiguity and setbacks. Hiring teams need to see a track record of thriving through uncertainty and demonstrating genuine learning agility from challenges. So, what's key for hiring teams? What's the net? During the course of an interview or conversation with an executive, tell me about here's a question. Tell me about a significant professional setback or
Yeah.
failure, right? That you experienced as a leader. What did you do? What did you learn from it? That continual learning agility, and specifically, how did you change your approach to leadership or problem solving moving forward? So I would say for the first segment of this conversation, those
Uh-huh.
are things that I think are abundantly important.
Quick question on that third one, which was like inspiring. You were talking about leadership style, and you said up and down and around and side, how you influence different people side to side, up and down. I imagine depending on the job, there's also like the external component, like you're like fundraising, have to inspire people in the community, or like a church, religious, healthcare organization or something. You're having to go to like different community groups and partner. I mean, there's a whole like community aspect of some jobs, depending what they are, I bet, that's not really within your company, correct? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up a really good point because you have to get people wrapped around a vision, a vision and a strategy, not just inside the organization,
Yeah.
but outside the organization as well. Otherwise, like, why would I pay anything? Why would I give you money for something that's in a nonprofit organization to do this thing, right? Why? What are you going to do on behalf of the communities here, right? But I also think too, right, another thing that a leader needs to do, which is this is sort of a tangential thing, but I think leadership, if these are individuals that are reporting in or not, or just people you're working with, I think instilling meaning and purpose into everybody's life, pouring into people that we're interacting with, if they're in a community outside an organization, it's still really important. Or if they're tasked with working with other people inside an organization. My point is this, Todd. I think somebody that's really passionate about the work.
Hmm.
What is the vision? Why should we buy into this thing? And then also, I think a leader is really tasked with instilling meaning and purpose. It's not just what are you really passionate about or work brings you joy, but what is it that, in terms of what you do every day, what is your meaning and your purpose to the work that you do every day? And if that's inside an organization or outside, it doesn't
Okay.
matter. So great leaders can do that.
You wanted to say something about something else, which is like quantifying the impact.
Yeah.
You're assessing the the impact they made, how they did it. So the first part we just talked about, which is like inspiration, leadership, and resilience, strategic thinking, emotional intelligence. You were talking about reading beyond the resume. So now you want to go a little deeper as an assessor, and you want to say, well, okay, what really was the impact they made, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is all about the candidate's story, the value, the impact, the performance behaviors, right? It's hugely important. So I would say that, so what factor, right? So it's articulating value proposition. I work with my candidates during a preps to get them to really understand that because a lot of people don't think that way, right? So it's not just about writing a resume for somebody, but it's like getting them to think about what they do and how they do it. That's the whole point. That's the coaching of it, right? So top executive talent doesn't just list accomplishments; they just don't. Uh, they can explicitly connect their achievements to broader organizational goals,
Mm.
strategic imperatives, and the impact they had. So executive candidates need to study the organization. They need to know a lot about the job they're interviewing for, because at the end of the day, those that are on the interview panel, they're assessing the executive candidate, are wondering, like, here are the big problems and here are the big goals.
Yeah.
Like, so the executive candidate, what do they need to do? They don't need to be just talking about a lot of these unrelated achievements in their career. My point is this, Todd, like, they need to make sure that they've actually done their homework and they know the job that they're interviewing for in the organization. Like, what are the goals?
Yeah.
So hiring teams, what does this mean for them? They need to push beyond what was done, but ask why it mattered, how it created like tangible value for the organization. Because at the end of the day, every executive needs to understand the business goals, strategies of an organization, and then what are those things that I need to do to really add value to achieve the organizational objectives. For example, I grew revenue by X. That's good, but I grew revenue by X
Yeah.
by also telling everybody like how you did it by fundamentally transforming sales process or something like
Yeah.
that. So what's key for hiring teams in this, beyond the immediate metrics or key performance indicators? What was the broader strategic value to align with the business goals and the mission of the organization, right? So, what was the broader strategic value of that initiative to the organization? Period.
Yeah.
That's what really matters to get right down to it. How did it position the company like for future success?
Okay.
You
So
know,
we have,
so I'd say that's a big thing.
so
Yeah.
we're talking about going beyond the resume. We're talking about looking at the actual tangible impact. And the last thing you wanted to talk about when you're assessing, evaluating, selecting a candidate as an interview or as someone on the hiring team, on a hiring panel, fit. So this is probably, well, it's a hot button issue because this is kind of how people are hired,
Right.
unfortunately. Maybe people are
Right.
not hired or hired because someone perceives that they're going to fit there or they click or something. What's the deal here? How do you avoid that being too
Hmm.
tangible, arbitrary, and subjective?
Yeah. It's the thing that comes up all the time. You know, I've facilitated a ton of interviews with search committees and debrief sessions where we're talking, and a lot of what comes up is like, oh, this person, they interviewed really well, but you know what? They're not a culture fit. So,
Right.
all right, okay, so let's peel the onion back a little bit more on that. One, you need to have a diversity champion, CHRO, or somebody that's brave enough to, during that debrief conversation after an interview, what is share a little bit more about that. That's valid. That's valid when you say that because culture is everything, right? It is. Um, but historically, culture fit has been often, and we all know this, right? It's been an unconscious bias
Yeah.
masquerading as a legitimate hiring
Yeah.
criterion, right? It just is. It implicitly meant someone exactly like us, right?
Yeah.
Basically, leading to a lot of different things, but it really impedes us from hiring great qualified candidates, great talent. That's what it's all about. We want great qualified candidates at the end of the day. It's a significant barrier to diversity, right? So I think it's really this. How do you get away from the cultural fit part of it? You need to shift to, I think, a culture add or a culture contribution. Instead of asking, will this person fit, quote unquote, in with our existing norms, ask what unique perspectives, experiences, and leadership styles can this executive add to our existing culture to help us evolve, grow, and become more robust?
Mm.
Emphasize really how these new perspectives will strengthen the team,
Love it.
challenge these assumptions,
Love it.
and prevent the groupthink, which happens. What's really interesting too, is a brief call out, is that we've gotten pretty smart about evaluating. And so what we'll do before like a group panel discussion to debrief after an interview, we will get a lot of individualized feedback on the candidate electronically, you know. And it's interesting because when you get all this feedback, you share it with the hiring manager, and then that very same person that provided this feedback, and they may have said one thing during that group debrief.
Yeah.
It's amazing to see how through the group think process their feedback evolves and changes based on what everybody else is saying.
Mm.
So I think you really need to shift to culture add, cultural contribution. You need to really define your culture in the organization. So here's my advice, real quickly, because I know we're running up on time.
Fine.
Before the interview process begins, I think really hiring teams must clearly define what their organizational culture is, period. And more importantly, what are the performance behaviors that exemplify that culture? Like what is it? Will translate abstract values to things like what is it? Like innovation? Is it integrity? Is it into? They need to be translated into observable, desired performance behaviors. Example again, openly shares ideas. This executive needs to challenge the status quo respectfully. They need to learn from failure. They need to, I don't know, consistently act with transparency. The key action, the net for hiring teams is this: develop a very clear, agreed upon definition of desired cultural behaviors for the role before interview. That's it.
Yeah. Do you ever, I think one of the issues, I guess this kind of is a common thread through everything you've just said, is like companies judge sometimes by the interview, not by the accomplishment, not by the person's track record. So if you're trying to measure whether someone was an inspirational leader who's going to inspire and coach their team and the community and government and whatever, that's not necessarily meaning you have to be inspiring in the interview, right? An interview is not a proxy for how you are on a job. You're trying to articulate what you've done on the job, but you don't have to be a certain personality in an interview to show that you have a certain level of accomplishment on the job.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, Todd, because we all know this to be true. Well, let me just say this. I always give feedback. Hey, be your genuine, authentic self. Be you. Because at the end of the day, when you get on the job, and if you're trying to be somebody you're not during an interview, guess what? It isn't going to work out. Just be you. Okay. But I'd also say this: like the interview is one piece of feedback, right, during an evaluation assessment process, right? Let's be honest with each other. We've interviewed people that have done an extraordinary job, doing a tap dance in an interview, and guess what? Despite your best efforts, they end up failing on the job because
Yeah.
right? So what I would say, just sort of like in closing or just feedback on this is executive interviews like are great. There is a data point in the overall arching decision making process. You also need to do referencing. Referencing is extraordinarily important. It's another data point in the collection
Uh-huh.
process, right? As you're evaluating. So you go with interviews, you go with referencing. What are you learning, right? And you need to be very prescriptive. And your referencing process needs to align with your interviewing process so that you're all on the same page there and getting really good input. Assessments are really important too, to some degree, depending on the level of the job. But everything you also pick up during the course of the initial phases of the recruiting process, additional data points. So what I'm really saying is this, right? I think data points don't just rely on the interview to make a decision, basically, is my point, right? But you
Good.
also need
Good.
to use different data points, referencing, assessments. There's more to it, but that's going to be really important as well because at the end of the day, like we all know, you're going to get those that interview poorly, but guess what? They're
Yeah.
extraordinary. They're
Yes.
extraordinary. They
Yeah.
just have trouble articulating or they just don't interview well. So all of
Yes.
that needs to be thought through well.
Yes. I love all this because really none of this, correct me if I'm wrong, nothing you've said is really healthcare only. This is all great stuff for every industry. So this is great advice. So again, Russell Podgorski, we talked about hiring health. We focused on healthcare because that's what you do. Healthcare executives, healthcare leaders, healthcare professionals. We talked about going beyond the resume. You talked about resilience and strategic thinking, emotional intelligence, and I think like leadership style. And then you talked about measuring the impact. Oh, I accomplished this and how. And then
Mhm.
lastly, cultural fit. So I hope that everyone can take away something here, regardless of the industry, healthcare or not. Again, Russell Podgorski, I'm Todd Raffel. Hey, thanks so much. This has been great, and thanks for listening.